What's up everyone? Today I'm going to start a series of videos talking about Azure Function Apps. We'll go through how to create one, the different configurations you can use with them, the programming languages, and just slowly dive deeper and deeper in how you can use them and integrate them into your workflows. My name is Jeff. This is Jeff Brown Tech. Let's go ahead and get started. I think the best way to get started with Azure Function Apps is to go create one, and we'll go through the different components of it and see how everything ties together and have a quick demo at the end of how it works. Here I am out in my Azure Portal. I already have a resource group created here that I want to put all my resources in. So we'll go ahead and click on Create. We'll search for Function App. Select it here from the results and go ahead and click on Create. Now the first thing you want to do when creating function apps is you have to select a hosting plan. Function apps are platform as a service offering, or PaaS, meaning you don't have to worry about the underlying compute. You don't have to configure a server, configure CPU, memory, anything like that. Azure just gives you access to run your code, and you don't have to worry about all that underlying stuff there. But you still have to select a hosting plan because they do come with different options. We have Flex Consumption, Functions Premium, App Service, and Container Apps environment. I usually just choose Consumption. It's very basic. It's pay as you go, so you only pay whenever your function runs, and it does auto scale up and down for you as demand increases or decreases. It might be missing a few options like VNet integration. You will get that with something like Functions Premium, or maybe you have an existing app service. App services have different tiers where you select different combinations of CPU and memory, and you can also configure auto scaling and things like that. You can put function apps on app services along with other web apps, so those can share underlying compute. But I think to get started, consumption is perfectly good, allows you to get familiar with it. And the things I've ran on them in the past might only run once or twice a day, so I really didn't need a lot of options around it. So we've got consumption selected. Let's go ahead and continue. Now here we are in creating a function app. We're going to configure the rest of the options. We're here on the Basics tab. I've got my subscription and resource group selected. We do need to give the function app a name. This needs to be a globally unique name all across Azure, just like you might get with a storage account. It is appended with .azurewebsites.net, which gives you a URL you can access if you need it. So we're going to jump in here and just call this JPT Funk App Demo. We'll put our region on here. So my fully qualified domain name for this will be JPT Funk App Demo westus2.azurewebsites.net. Next, we need to select our runtime stack. This is going to be what programming language we're going to use within our individual functions. We can use .NET, Node.js or JavaScript, Python, Java, PowerShell core, or custom handler. I've looked at custom handlers a little bit, and hopefully we'll get into a video of that when using Go or Golang. Just for example, let's select Node.js. We do have a couple of different versions here you can select. Some of them may be in preview. But let's go ahead and go back. We'll select PowerShell core, and our only version of that is 7.4. Next, let's choose our region. So let's go down and select West US 2. And you can also select your operating system. PowerShell works on Windows and Linux. I'm just going to leave it at Windows for right now. Next, let's go into storage. Now, when you create a function app, it has to be linked to a storage account because that storage account is going to store all your programming files. This is going to be the code that you write, whether it's a .NET program or PowerShell scripts or anything like that. Those do need somewhere to store, and as you create each function inside your function app, it'll have them divvied up into folders. By default, this does try to create a new storage account. If you have an existing one, you can select it, but what I recommend is just having a storage account per function app. That way, all that code is together. And if you ever don't need this function app anymore, you can delete that associated storage account. I don't like the auto-generated name of this one, so I'm going to create a new one. We'll call it JBT Funk App West US 2 Storage. Perfect. That looks good. We'll say OK. We'll leave the rest of the defaults for adding an Azure Files connection. Leave off our diagnostic settings for right now. Go into networking. We will enable public access, but you can turn this off and probably put in some firewall rules or anything like that if you want to. Or if you have another different hosting plan, you can enable VNet integration, probably put some private endpoints on it, really secure it down and keep that network traffic internal. Right now, I'm just going to do public access. Next, let's go into monitoring. Function apps do integrate with application insights. You can deploy a new one along with it, or if you want to select a new one, you can. This isn't a requirement. There are some ways around it. Maybe if you're just working on creating a new one or testing this out. But for right now, we will go ahead and enable this. I am going to create a new one because I don't quite like this name. I like to tag my resources with just abbreviations of what the resource actually is. So when I read it, I know exactly what it is. So we'll actually give it the same name as our function app, but I'm just going to append it with APPI for application insights. Application insights do integrate with Log Analytics Workspace. Looks like I have one here in WestUS 2 already. Go ahead and select OK. Next, in the deployment tab, you can integrate this with GitHub to deploy your code that you've written via GitHub Actions. You can also use Azure pipelines inside of Azure DevOps. We'll configure some of this later. I want to get into that into different videos. Or we'll skip our tags for right now. Let's go ahead and review and create our function app. All right, our resource is finished deploying. Let's actually go into the resource group and see everything that went into the function app deployment here. We first have our app service plan. That is our underlying CPU and memory for executing the code. Our function app, which is going to hold all our different functions, application insights for monitoring, and our storage account for file storage. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into our function app. And the first thing you'll see here at the bottom is creating functions in your preferred environment. We can do it right here in the Azure Portal. We can do this inside of Visual Studio Code or other editors or the CLI. Let's just go ahead and jump in, creating our first function here in the Azure Portal. Now, the neat thing about Azure Functions is they can be triggered in different ways. You can have an HTTP trigger and call it like an API endpoint. You can set it on a timer or a schedule. You can queue it off different things inside of storage accounts, like Azure Queue Storage for a messaging system, messages from your service bus. You can also do it whenever a file is uploaded into blob storage. We have IoT Hub, SendGrid, just lots and lots of different things. And you can actually have multiple things trigger a function app. Usually your first example of trying to do something here is an HTTP trigger. We'll go ahead and select that and go into next. You do have to give the function a name, so we'll just leave it at the default there. And then we have an authorization level. This controls whether or not your function requires an API key or how you can authenticate to it. There are different options here. You can do it at the individual function level. There is admin where you can run any function inside the function app or make it anonymous. We'll go ahead and choose at the function authorization level so we can see those keys when it creates those later. Finished up there though, let's go ahead and click on create. So we have our HTTP trigger 1 function here inside of our entire function app. It comes with some default code here for PowerShell. Let's take a look at what it's doing here. Line 4, we have parameters incoming called request, and then our trigger metadata. We are using write host to output something to the console, just saying it's starting to process the request. We are then creating a variable called name, and we're looking at the incoming request parameter. So that's when you call this HTTP endpoint, you can put things inside the URL to pass into the function app. Then we're looking for a property called name. But if that is blank or doesn't exist, you can also pass in information through a JSON body into the function. Basically, we're just seeing, did we pass in something called name, either in the query or the body? We'll see that when we demo this here in just a second. Then we're creating another variable called body. We're saying it executed successfully. And we're looking to see if name does have a value. We're going to replace that inside and output for our body here and then output it. And this is the other thing, like I was mentioning earlier with function apps, we have triggers that are incoming, but we can also use them with these output bindings to do different things. So we could go make a change to a file somewhere or a database or send a message back. You don't have to worry about how to code all that. You can just say push output binding. In this case, we're sending an HTTP response of OK or 200 and the body on the return. Down here at the bottom, we're seeing the output of our application insight logs. If you didn't deploy with application insights, you can also switch over to file system logs and you can see the output as your function runs. But at the default here, let's go ahead and test and run. We have our HTTP method. We'll leave it at post. We're using our master key, but we can also use the function key if we wanted to. This is the query parameters I was talking about. So we can input name value pairs here. So if we put in name and go over here as value, put Jeff, that puts it into our URL. We're not going to put any headers in, but then we also have in our body here, name Azure. Actually going to take this out and just send over a blank body. And let's go ahead and run this. Now we see our response code 200 OK means it completed successfully. Our response content, it says, hello, Jeff. This trigger function executed successfully. We see that over here on line 18 because we did pass in a value for name. Let me go ahead and close this. If we take a look at our App Insight Logs page here, we can see it authenticated successfully. And we see the things that it outputted here saying, the PowerShell HTTP trigger function processed a request. That's the same thing we see up here on line 7, and everything's good to go. So within the portal here, you can do test runs and everything, but let's actually try to call this another way. Let's get our function URL. And these function URLs that it generates here, we'll put in our authorization codes. Remember, we didn't make this anonymous. We are requiring some type of key to be passed in so we can execute it. We have our master keys and our function keys. So let's go ahead and copy this. Now what I should be able to do is pass in a value for name in our query string here, which means our URL. So if I do an ampersand, the name of the property is name, and then pass in a value equals Jeff. So if I go back and execute this, get rid of this here, and now it says, hello, Jeff, the trigger executed successfully. So that's just one way you can pass information into your function app if you need to process it. And you can do it through the URL here. You can do a JSON body. We'll probably go into that a little bit later. Back inside our function here for our HTTP trigger, let's go through a couple of these other tabs. Our integration here shows our triggers and inputs. Right now we have just an HTTP trigger, but we can add other inputs, maybe processing something from our service bus or a file. We have then our function and then our different outputs. Right now it's just HTTP response. Let's actually go in and look at some of these configurations. If we go into our trigger here for HTTP call, this is where that incoming parameter name came from, is request. So if we were to change this to something else, we could then update that back in our code to refer to it. Request is pretty good. Our authorization level, you can limit your HTTP methods to get or post. Let's just leave it at something like post. We then have our function, and then what we're doing with our output, we're sending back an HTTP response, and that is named response. So let's actually go back, since I mentioned that, let's go look at our code again. And you can see, so this is where that comes in, the $ request. That's the name of our incoming HTTP trigger. And then our response comes back in our push output binding. The name is response. So that's how it knows to associate that with our HTTP response or output. If you had multiple output bindings, whatever you name them here, you could just call push output binding name and call that different output. We have our different function keys. These are our authorizations we can use to call our function. This is the default at the function level. We'll jump back out and see the master keys. Look at the different times this function has been called or invoked. We can see a couple of the examples we've just done here. Take a look at our logs. This goes back and integrates with application insights. And then different metrics. Probably don't have a lot right now since just created, but we can see execution counts, how many were successful, failed, or if we responded with any other HTTP status codes. So that does it for the basics of the function. Let's go back to the function app and take a look at just a couple of other things. Now, we're going to mention the functions inside your function app are based on files, and those files determine, the code that's run. But for function apps inside of PowerShell, there are a couple of other things we can take a look at. If we expand out functions and go into app files, these are files that are associated with this function app as a whole. That's actually maybe a good time to talk about some terminology real quick. Our JBT func app demo S2 or WestUS2 that we created here is a function app. That's the whole encompassing thing, the settings, the PowerShell, the region, and everything. And within the function app, you have individual functions. We actually can go create more and more and more as we needed. It is a little confusing because I keep maybe saying, take a look at your function app here. I might just mean function, but function app is the entirety of everything. And within our function app, we have individual functions. You can say a lot about AWS not naming their things necessarily what they represent, but in this case with Azure, it can be a little confusing calling a function app and then functions within your function app. Anyway, little tangent there. These app files here are associated with everything inside the function app. So within our app files that are associated here with everything inside the function app, we have a host.json. There are lots of other settings you can have in here to control your function app. If we drop down the menu in here, you do have a profile. So this is this exact same you might see if you're working with PowerShell on your local system. You have a profile. In this case, it's just looking to see if we have an MSI or managed services identity. That is something I plan on covering. If that exists, it disables some stuff with Azure and automatically connects you out into your Azure account to do different things. We'll go over that in some other videos. But then you also have requirements here, a PSD1 file. You can have this go and download Azure modules from the PowerShell gallery automatically, and you can do version constraints. So right here, it's giving you an example. It's commented out right now, but the entire Azure module looking for versions, anything in a major version of 13. Definitely something we'll go over later also when working with PowerShell. But you have these three files here. This is specific to PowerShell. I'm not really familiar what would happen with .NET and JavaScript. Let's go back to our app keys. Like we were talking about, these are authorizations in order to run the function app. We have a master one and a default. Using either of these would allow you to call any function inside the function app that has authorization level set at it. If you have it set at anonymous, if you have it set to anonymous, you don't have to use these at all. A couple other things here. If we go in deployment, this will get into integrating with GitHub Actions or Azure Pipelines. You can set environment variables just like you have on your system. If you've worked with PowerShell before, there are built-in environment variables that you can refer to, like who's logged in right now, host name, processor, things like that. A couple of things that we have here. We have our connection into our application insights, a connection string. You can just really use these if you have an environment variable. Maybe it's something from an Azure Key Vault, a value, or some other type of secret that you need to pass into your functions. You can use this here. Next, we have configuration. We have our runtime version, daily use quota, some other general settings. Maybe we get a newer version of PowerShell. Oh, it actually looks here like we can downgrade. That was an option when we created it. It just went to 7.4. 3264-bit. You can turn off FTP, set your HTTP version. Just some, some security settings here that you want to make sure of. HTTPS only, so make sure you're using secure or SSL. Just some other nitty-gritty things here. Yeah, so I think this is a decent introduction to function apps. You can go create a default one, play around with that HTTP trigger if you want. Let's jump back. One more thing I want to show you. Let's go back to our resource group and go take a look at our storage account. Here we are in the storage account. Before you try to go take a look at the files that are backing the function app, you do need to give yourself some additional permissions. Right now, you probably just have access to manage the storage account resource, but not actually to go in and look at the data. In order to do that, let's go into access control. I've already given myself some role assignments here. We'll just review what they are real quick. I gave myself the storage blob data reader. I really don't need contributor or owner access to get into these because you're not going to be managing them individually typically. You just need to be able to maybe go in and read them as needed. So here I am, a storage blob data reader. And then to go look at the Azure file stuff, you need storage file data privileged reader. This allows you to go look at your Azure Files shares. But just make sure you have those permissions there if you want to go take a look at these directly inside the storage account. Again, typically you wouldn't need to. I'm just trying to show you how these things interact and go together. If we go back into storage browser, we'll go into blob containers. There are a couple of containers here. There's not a lot in here right now. If we had some secrets, maybe if we go into web jobs host, there's locks and sync triggers and things like that. Really not a lot in here right now, but the things we saw inside our function app are actually inside our file shares. We have the name of our function app along with a unique identifier. If If we go into here, we have a couple of folders, but what I want to show you is if we go into site and then www.root, first you can see here we have host, profile, and requirements files. We saw those earlier when we were taking a look at adding in modules or configuring stuff inside of our profile. So that's actually, this is where those files sit that the function app is using. And then you'll notice we have a folder called HTTP trigger1, which was the name of our function. If we go into it, we have our run.ps1, which is actually the code that we saw inside of our example that's processing the incoming request. We also have a function.json. In that file, it just has defined our incoming triggers and output bindings and things like that. But just kind of wanted to show that relationship here of the storage account hosting these files for our function app to run it. Anyway, I think that's a decent introduction that we've got going on right now, just how to create one. Some of the defaults there, we'll dive into it a little bit more in future videos, and just, anything I can think of that I've been using function apps for in the past. I think this is a good stopping point. Anyway, that does it for this one. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.